Good evening and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. Oh, you can. Okay. Hello, can you hear me now? Good evening and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Jessica Sullivan, one of the store's booksellers. As you may know, we host almost 1,000 events each year at this store and at the two other locations in the DC area at the Wharf and at Union Market. There's a calendar of events at our information desk that lists all of this month's events, which you're more than welcome to take. Just a few notes before we begin. First, to avoid any distractions, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. Feel free to post about the event, take pictures, but please make sure that all the sound is off. We also ask that if you have something you'd like to ask during the question and answer portion of tonight's event, that you stand up and address your question into the microphones we have set up so that everyone can hear you. We have a microphone stand by the water cooler and by the pillar to the left. We are audio recording and filming tonight's event, so it's important that we hear your question. After the event, a signing line will follow the talk, and that will also form to my left. Please fold up your chairs and place them on something solid before joining the signing line. A copy of the book can be purchased at our registers. Tonight we are thrilled to welcome Andrea Bernstein, the author of American Oligarchs, to Politics and Prose. Bernstein is the Peabody and duPont-Columbia award-winning co-host of WNYC podcast Trump Inc. Her riveting exposé, American Oligarchs, traces the rise of the Trump and Kushner families from their arrival as immigrants to the U.S. during the Gilded Age to their current position atop the oligarchy. She draws on hundreds of interviews and more than 100,000 pages of documents and shows how both families built fortunes from government money by blurring the line between public and private interests and leveraging their growing political power. The New York Times called Bernstein's narrative repertorial, pointed, and unsparing, while reinforcing her theme that the Trumps and the Kushners are ruthless, cold, power-hungry, and endlessly ambitious. Tonight she'll be in conversation with Frank Foer, a staff writer for The Atlantic and former editor for The New Republic. Please help me welcome them to Politics and Prose.
Hi. I really highly recommend this book because so much of the story of the Trump administration and its corruption it's often overwhelming, and I feel like the stories just come at such a fast pace, and there's not often narrative that sets them in a context where you can actually sit back and say, oh, wow, this is just what's happened to our republic, and here are the characters, and here are their motives. And so I think you did an extraordinary job of packaging a story that in some ways is really simple because, as the description of the New York Times review said, like the motives of the characters in some ways is very simple. It is about making money. It is about ambition, and yet, when I read this book, I felt like so much of what I'd come across over the course of the last couple of years felt fresh to me, seeing you kind of stitch it all together and add those extra layers of detail and explanation and connection to the broader themes of our time. So before we get into the meat of it, I wanted to start by just asking you about how you arrived at this book and to just talk a little bit about your career and the project that you've been involved in, because I'm sure there are some devoted listeners of the Trump Inc. podcast in the room. But that means there's a whole vast chunk of the room that doesn't fully appreciate the value of Trump Inc. because they're not exposed to it. So
So first of all, thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? No? Now can you hear me? Okay. Thank you all for coming. I'm sort of overwhelmed by the turnout tonight, and also thank you, Frank. It's such an honor to be in conversation with you. I have learned so much from your reporting. Frank and I have a similar obsession with oligarchs, so it's great to be here together to talk about oligarchs. In answer to the question how this book came about, so what happened is that my colleague Ilya Maritz, who's here tonight, yay Ilya, who happens to be here reporting.
On this very room. I think there are oligarchs in our midst.
And I, after the 2016 election, we thought, well, what should we be doing? And I had been covering corruption and money, power, and influence, and he had been covering sort of more the business side of things, and we thought we really need to look in the business of Trump. So we started to look at the business of Trump, and the first story that we did was, well, the first thing that we did was we said, okay, we're going to look at Trump Tower, and we're going to see who lives there. So we started to look at who lives there, and then we started naming all the shell companies, and we got up to 43G, which was Paul Manafort's apartment, which we thought, oh, that looks weird. So then we reported that out, and we talked to a bunch of experts, and we said, what is this pattern? And they said, looks like money laundering. So we did that story, looks like money laundering. Turns out it was money laundering. And we did a number of stories like this, and at some point during the year, so I had covered the Bridgegate trial. Do people know what Bridgegate is? So I had covered that, and some point during the year, an editor from Norton sent me an email, and then he went away, and then I went away, and then I started to do a story, and then months passed, and then he said, maybe we should have a lunch, and we had a lunch, and he came and he said, well, you know a lot about Bridgegate, same people, why don't you do a story about the Kushners and the Trumps? And I thought about it, and I said, yeah, it's a story about actually the same people, but also about the same trends, sort of money, power, and influence. And that was the point at which I really thought about writing this book. And I wanted it to be a book about not just these families and not just what's happening in the White House now, but a book about our country and the choices that we've made that brought us to this moment. So that is how this book came to be.
I mean, we had All the President's Men. If you pardon the Yiddishism, this is All the President's Mishpacha. And
So can I just say that Jared Kushner's father's first language was Yiddish, so appropriate.
It seems like the underlying theory of the book, in a certain way, is that family is destiny. That you narrate. What's so interesting about the Trumps and the Kushners is that it seems like the themes that we see now, like the lying, the deceptive business practices, are kind of transmitted through the generations. I
think that is especially true with the Trump family. You can go back to Donald Trump's grandfather and his business practices. So he was in the hospitality business. He would make sure he had the best location. And in one of the first ventures he had in Washington, he lied and said he was going to be mining because that way he could get the land. But
place us. Which Trump are you talking about?
Friedrich
How many generations?
Trump. So this
Friedrich
is Donald Trump's grandfather. So, and then but even while he was doing that, he bought wood to build a restaurant, so he obviously wasn't going to mine it. And this is the kind of business practice that we see over the years. The Kushner family has had more of an evolution. Jared Kushner's grandfather was a more straightforward real estate developer, although, as I talk about in the book, he really took advantage of government benefits and government programs that really enabled him to become a multimillionaire from having arrived here with $2 in his pocket. So there's more of an evolution in that family, but there is a through line because that family was a family of Holocaust survivors and was a family where rule breaking was important to survival. And that is a trend that we see now. However, the thing about family being destiny, I don't know, because I think that these people made specific choices. And I wanted to examine those specific choices, which I don't think are the choices that everybody would have made in those circumstances.
Without a doubt. But there is this process of acculturation that's very interesting, and you do see certain tendencies repeated.
Yeah. It is a multi-generational saga. And one of the things I wanted to look at was how the codes get passed from generation to generation. And I hope I have been successful in that.
Well, why don't we start by talking about the Trump bordello, by which I don't mean the White House.
You mean the one that, so we're talking about his grandfather now.
Yeah.
So his grandfather was in the hospitality business. And one of the things, he
The
sold
hospitality
food.
business.
He made his money during the last North American gold rush in the Yukon. And he had restaurants that sold food and liquor and access to sex. So that's where he made his money. And he left the gold rush having earned a lot of money. And a lot of people lost money or didn't make money in the gold rush. He went back to New York and he bought land in Queens at exactly the time that the government was building a bridge to Queens, which meant that land was suddenly about to become very valuable. And that's how the Trump real estate empire was born.
So what did Trump, the president, learn from Friedrich and Fred, his grandfather and father?
Wow. Well, a lot of things, but I think one of the things that we are seeing now tonight is the sense of rules not applying to them. And we see that over and over again with the way that his father ran his business, in which he really cultivated political connections. The New York Times has called the way he maneuvered his tax and income streams to avoid paying taxes outright fraud. That there's a family history of not believing the rules that apply and actively trying to make sure the rules don't apply. So, for example, Fred Trump and then Donald Trump were huge contributors to the Brooklyn Democratic Party, which controlled the district attorney, which never really investigated anything they did. They were big contributors to the Manhattan district attorney's favorite charity and also to his political campaign. And there's a story in the book that we wrote about with our colleagues at ProPublica and The New Yorker about how Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka avoided criminal indictment, which also involved a very large donation to the Manhattan DA. And you see this all coming to a logical conclusion where Donald Trump is president and literally does not feel that the laws apply. I mean, that is what is being argued in the Senate now tonight as we're sitting here a few miles from here, and also the case that he's making to the U.S. Supreme Court in a number of cases. But the most significant one, I think, is the Trump v. Vance one, where he is saying that he cannot even be criminally investigated for as long as he's president. And that case will be heard in March. So there's a long line of this, of there not really being a reckoning that starts back in the earliest days of the Trump family business and continues to now. Which is, by the way, why I call the book American Oligarchs.
Yeah.
So, because it's an oligarchic business model where the very wealthy can really control the levers of government and not suffer consequences. And this is something that we keep seeing repeated and repeated in the Trump family business.
Just to pause on that, I mean, I think that the term oligarch is a really useful one, and it's also, I think, almost a little bit startling, I think, for a lot of American readers, because it's a term that's now so associated with Russians and Ukrainians, and but yet it's kind of we've fostered the exact same sort of system here.
Yeah, no, so when I started the book, I didn't know that there was going to be an impeachment trial when it was released in which oligarchs were going to be mentioned every minute, it seems. So when I met Frank during the opening arguments of the Paul Manafort trial, and one of the things that was particularly striking to me from that trial was the testimony on the very first day where one of the witnesses was asked, well, who paid for your campaign work for Viktor Yanukovych, the corrupt former president of Ukraine? And the answer was, the oligarchs paid. And I thought to myself, wow, that's amazing. Like, there's no PACs, there's no super PACs, there's just straight up the rich people pay to get the political outcome that we want. And I have been thinking since that moment about how far our system has moved to that, which is not just about Trump, it's about a whole system of campaign finance that has been eroded and eroded, particularly since the Citizens United decision, which is having its 10th anniversary this week.
Right. It's like a lot of the hacking of the last election, or the hacking of our politics, actually happens kind of in this perfectly legalized sort of way where money flows in and we don't know where it comes from. All right, so you've done all this research on Trump leading up this generational saga. If we went back to 2016 and kind of knowing everything that you know now and you've reported so thoroughly, if you could wave kind of one thing in front of the voters and say, stop this man, he's corruption incarnate and is going to erode the republic, what would it have been?
Well, I do think in 2016 that he was able to offer himself as a solution to a real problem, which was a sense of alienation. So there's a scene that I have in the book, which was right after the Citizens United, where I was out reporting in Ohio, and I was filing a story, and I was in a hotel room, and I noticed that there were so many ads on television, and they were saying, your congressman is a crook, your congressman kidnapped his wife. Okay, maybe they didn't say that, but there were bars, there were bags of cash, there was this constant stream of messaging. Government is bad, government is terrible, they're stealing from you. So it's a totally logical human reaction that when you see that 24/7, that's what you believe. Government is terrible. And that is the breach that Trump walked into. And he said, everybody remembers, I alone can fix it. And I think that that is an argument that should have been interrogated, because I do think he was able to connect with people on that level, but obviously his entire history as a businessman and as an actor in the political life of New York and New Jersey suggested otherwise. And he tried to make the argument, I can fix it because I know how bad it is. But in fact, when he came to the White House, he just perpetuated the systems that he himself had used and made them more available for other people to use. So it's just so easy to pay the president and get what you want, which is happening every night when people go into the Trump International Hotel and book a room or have a party or buy drinks. They are literally paying the president, and he notices. Well, how do we know he notices and cares? In the transcript of the phone call with Zelensky was very sure to say to Trump, oh, I stayed at a Trump hotel. So everybody around the world has gotten the message that they have to be able to say to Trump, I have patronized your properties, I have paid you money, and that gets his attention.
In the course of reporting and pulling everything together and analyzing it, what did you learn about Trump? What are the things that you discovered as you stitched it all together?
So I think one of the things I learned is when I started the book, I thought to myself, he's really not rich enough to have impacted our democracy. And after having looked at the way that he and his family really corroded the system from within in New York and New Jersey, they not only gave money, but they would hire people. They would hire the fundraiser for the governor when they wanted something for the governor, or the lawyer for the controller when they wanted something from the controller. Over and over and over again, in New Jersey, people that were on the casino regulating bodies were sort of basically unable to criticize Trump because he was so close to the politicians who appointed them. And a lot of people who would perhaps be inclined to be critical of Trump got jobs as judges or something, and then were not able to do that. And that was it's a real outlier. So I know people think New York and New Jersey real estate is shady, and they are correct, but both the Kushner family and the Trump family are outliers on the scale. So one of the things that I really came to the conclusion is this kind of behavior, generation after generation, did break the system and did corrode the system and did really affect where our democracy is now.
So that's the Trump story. The Kushner story is, I gotta say, incredible. And it begins with, I think, one of the more memorable Holocaust survival stories, or a couple of them that I've ever come across. Maybe you could tell the Ray Kushner story.
Right. So Jared Kushner's grandmother is from a town in what is now Belarus, which was then northeast Poland, and has this just amazing story of survival that made me really think about the randomness of who survived the Holocaust and also the not randomness of it. But there is story after story about how the Nazis came in to commit their mass murders. One story is that after the Nazis came into this town, they brought all the Jews into this courthouse basically on a freezing December day, and they said, you go to the right and you go to the left, and one way was to live and one way was to die. And the Kushners were put on the line to die. And at that time, at that moment, a Nazi came to them and said, is anybody here a furrier? They were furriers. And so they said, okay, we need you, because they needed fur coats and hats to press on to Moscow. So they were pulled out of the line to die. But she was unsure at that moment. Her mother, Jared Kushner's great-grandmother, was unsure what was going to happen. So she said to one of her daughters, you run, one of you will survive. And the daughter that ran ended up being taken to the trenches where thousands of Jews were shot that day and basically had to fall into their own graves. So there's just an incredible series of stories of survival like this. And eventually, from an area where there were tens of thousands of Jews, 300 or so were living in this ghetto. And one of the things that was really interesting to me is that the mind doesn't want to, I think, embrace bad consequences. So there was always a sense of like, it can't get worse, right? It's so bad, we're definitely at the worst point. And then it did get worse. And there was also a sense of the survivors, there was some reason why they survived. But when thousands of people have died, they basically came to the consensus that they had to get out or they were going to be killed. So they dug a tunnel several football fields long in length and 2 feet wide. It took them 3 months. They hid the dirt in the walls, and they crawled out, and all of them did get out from the tunnel. Some of them, including Jared Kushner's great uncle, ran in the wrong direction, and the Nazis got them. But some of them got to the forest where there was a group of partisan Jews, and they lived in the forest for the winter. So it is a sort of incredible story of survival. What happens after that is that they cross borders illegally and change up their family relationships in order to immigrate, because immigration laws were so, even after the war, there were such anti-Semitic quotas that they were stuck in Italy. So they had to sort of change their names. Jared Kushner's grandfather was born Yusel Berkowitz. He changed his name to Joe Kushner, posing as his father-in-law's son, which they felt would be more favorable for immigration in order to immigrate to this country.
And
so that's the backstory.
Right. And just you dwell.
Oh, also I should say I believe that Belarus, I think, is one of the new countries on the travel ban as of yesterday proposed.
Right. Well, just to continue down that line, because in the book you very powerfully dwell on the irony that with his with the kind of funny records that they had, and like all the ways in which they kind of did everything to wheedle and deceive to get their way into the United States. Like there's no way that that CBP would tolerate. They would turn them around if they caught them for that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what would have happened, and I think that there is when Ivanka Trump was asked about family separation in the spring of 2018, she said, well, it was a low point, but she also said, you have to play by the rules. But her children's great-grandparents did not play by the rules. And to me, that was why that story is important. Not that they shouldn't have done whatever they needed to do to survive. It's because it's a comment on where we are today in this moment.
Jared Kushner is born in like a very distinctive household, and I think it's really, I mean, the context for kind of his childhood and especially his father and his uncle, I think are worth you kind of going into a little bit of detail on, because they help explain where he comes from.
So, so he grew up in Livingston, New Jersey. So this is where like the whole Bridgegate thing comes in, because there's it's a really interesting culture. I mean, Livingston, New Jersey is a place where everybody is aware of how much everybody else has. The Kushners had a big house at the top of the hill. Chris Christie is also from Livingston, New Jersey. He had a small house at the bottom of the hill. And it there was this group of people, they were called the Holocaust Builders. They built homes, and mostly they were private. But Charlie Kushner, Jared Kushner's father, was a very public person, and he began making a lot of donations. One of the real places where the Kushner family and the Trump family diverge is that Jared Kushner's father was caught and served time in prison for bank fraud and tax fraud, tax evasion, campaign finance violations, and witness tampering. So that was the context, and that happened just as Jared Kushner was becoming an adult, basically, as he was starting law school and business school. But there's a whole lot more in the book about the family past, which you should read.
It's juicy. So the one other parallel between the Trumps and the Kushners is also this kind of, they both, the siren song of Manhattan kind of ends up ultimately summoning them both, that they're people who come from across the bridges, and like there's the big shiny city, and they want that. And it seems like in order to prove some sort of point to the world.
Yeah, no, I think without doubt. I mean, Donald Trump his father was building these modest houses in Queens, and his father thought that was a good business model, and Donald Trump wanted to come into Manhattan and be with the glitz. Same story for the Kushner family. Charlie Kushner got out of prison. Jared Kushner bought a newspaper, the New York Observer, and he also bought for $1.8 billion the most expensive office tower in the history of New York real estate. And then came the crash right after that. But what was important to them clearly was making a statement. We have arrived. We are powerful. Respect us.
And in fact, does one of the Kushners actually say that? Jared says it or something? No.
So there's a party.
Yeah.
Where after Jared Kushner buys the New York Observer, where I worked, but before he came on the scene, they have a party at the Four Seasons. And all of these sort of New York figures come, and it is really clear that they are finally paying their respects to the Kushner family, who've had this sort of fraught relationship to the power elite, but then they get there, and there was a sense that they had arrived in Manhattan as a Manhattan real estate family.
So I think a lot of everybody who pays attention to Javanka has questions about what actually goes through their minds, that they try to distance themselves strategically sometimes from the father-in-law figure. What is the proper way to understand their psychology? What's the right way to evaluate them morally?
I feel like I would need to ask a rabbi how to evaluate them morally. But I think that obviously they both come from families where family loyalty is the most important thing. And when you look at the way Jared Kushner has survived and the people that he's survived, I mean, Reince Priebus and Jim Kelly and Mattis and Tillerson and H.R. McMaster and Mike Flynn and John Bolton and on and on and on and on, all of these people Jared Kushner has survived. And part of the reason is certainly because he is so loyal to his father-in-law, and he comes from a family where family is important, and he married into a family where family is important. One of the things I talk about in the book is that, when he bought the New York Observer, a lot of people thought, okay, well, so he's kind of vaguely liberal, which is sort of what people thought the Observer was. And plus, he had come from a very his family had been very large donors to the Democratic Party. So people really thought that was what he was. And one of the things I do is trace his political evolution. Same thing with Ivanka. I think that people would be surprised to learn that even in 2012, she was very, very critical of Barack Obama. She was critical of his policies, gave a lot of money to Republicans. But I don't think that people in New York understood this. And there's a lot of betrayal in the book, you will find out. But one of the interesting betrayals a lot of people told me is people sort of in New York society felt betrayed because they were sure once Jared and Ivanka went to the White House, they would still have their connection and they would be able to reason with them. And they would be able to convince them. I mean, some people even said it out loud. For example, the mayor of New York City said, Bill de Blasio said, I know Jared Kushner and I know I can talk to him. A lot of people told me that privately. They thought that they were opening lines of communication and were stunned when he didn't take what they thought was the New York side, but defended his father-in-law. So I think that was a failure of understanding on the part of the society. I don't think it was so much that they were acting so much differently, but I think people brought certain assumptions about how they would act and were surprised when that was not borne out.
This is almost a rhetorical question, but just given like the venality that you describe of Jared Kushner from a pretty early age, right? And Ivanka being at the heart of a very venal enterprise, and like, how did New York society? I mean, isn't it a damning indictment of New York society that they thought of them as kind of run-of-the-mill figures?
Yes and no, because they gave to all of these causes. They gave to the freedom to marry, and they sort of presented as sort of part of the general consensus. And this was something that, Ivanka Trump was raised in Manhattan and went to private schools and was a member of the Metropolitan Opera and was able to really be a part of the world in a way that her father never quite was. So I think that the answer is, they were sort of part of society. I mean, I don't blame people entirely, but, it's sort of that thing about imagining bad consequences. And, I think that is what happened to a lot of people from New York.
So to flash forward just a little bit. So you've been such a close student of the Russia scandals. And I'm going to ask you just a couple questions about this. First, what was your reaction to the Mueller report? And were you satisfied by the Mueller report and what it revealed?
I believe we spoke the day the Mueller report was released. I thought the Mueller report was thrilling. I learned so much from it, including, we were talking about oligarchs. We were talking about this Russian oligarch named Peter Avin and what he had told Mueller about how there was an all-hands oligarchs meeting with Vladimir Putin after the election because Vladimir Putin wanted to send a message and wanted to strengthen his ties with the Trump administration. So he had this group of Russian businessmen who understood that for them to maintain their power, they had to do what Putin wanted. So they carried all of these messages, and they saw something that I think a lot of people in this country didn't see. They saw very early on that Jared Kushner was going to be an immensely important person. I think even before people in this country understood he was even going to be a part of the administration, the Russians knew that, had a plan, but they also understood that the way in was going to be to discuss business deals. And for me, that was a kind of amazing revelation of the Mueller report. I mean, I think that the Mueller report has so much interesting information because it shows about, when we started doing this kind of coverage a few years ago, people kept saying, well, is this a crime? Is this a crime? Is this a crime? And I think we understand tonight the folly of such a question. that really isn't the point. Is there a crime? I think what the Mueller report did is sort of lay out the facts of what happened, which were kind of shocking. And all of the different approaches and all of the ways that the Trump campaign let these approaches happen. Not to, not even to talk about all the obstruction of justice and all of that, which was obviously deeply disturbing. So, I mean, it's complicated because I think that, it was sort of preordained that there wasn't going to be an indictment, and I think that was a very frustrating reaction. One of the things I think is very confusing about this whole administration is the cycle of consequences has been broken. So, I mean, I've covered corruption for a long time, and, people have been indicted or gone to prison after stories that I've written, maybe not always just sentences, maybe justice isn't actually done, but with this current administration, that cycle seems to be broken. I think one of the reasons it's broken is because there's no sense of there's anything wrong. There doesn't seem to be any shame about it. And so I think that one of the frustrations with the Mueller report is that all this stuff could come out and they said, so what? And then the reaction was, okay, well, the report was flawed, but I think that the reception was perhaps flawed rather than the report itself.
All right, if
I mean, also,
yeah,
I dug into those documents. Mueller, those prosecutors released a lot of information to us in the various court cases that they brought. There's a big story about American democracy and what happened immediately prior and during this administration that is told in those documents that is fascinating.
I know. I remember you actually calling me on the phone and saying, did you see in whatever it was Exhibit 791 in the Manafort trial, like the cash that was coming from
Oleg Deripaska. Yeah. Oleg Deripaska. I know. I wanted Frank to know about the memo about Oleg Deripaska because you've done so much work on Oleg Deripaska. So I want to make sure you saw that memo.
But all right, so I'm going to keep pushing you on this just a little bit. So if you were to, given that the Mueller report was written in legalese, and given that when it came to the kind of ultimate concluding lines, he kind of fudged things, right? Because he was trapped in this collusion. If you were to summarize the Mueller report and put it in kind of the Andrea Bernstein, your phrasing, your framing, what would you say that it showed us?
I hope I've said some of that in the book, because I think what it shows is how democracy is being unraveled. And I think that's what it shows broadly. And it also shows specific actions of people, which is just so stunning. I mean, every day in this administration, there's something so stunning that I went to cover the Trump v. Vance case where Trump's lawyer was asked, so could the president shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and have immunity from investigation? And then I went on the radio and I talked about that and we played the tape. And then afterwards I was like, that couldn't have happened. They couldn't have said that. I had to go back and listen to the tape to make sure I just hadn't said the wrong thing to 6 million people. But in fact, that is what they said. So I feel like the Mueller reports, the things that they laid out are kind of shocking, but also they're like of a piece, and each day there's a new shock. I mean, I think that one of the things about Mueller, I think everybody knows by now that after Mueller testified and it was kind of a dud, the next day is when Trump called Zelensky. So I think that what has happened in Ukraine and what was happening as I was concluding writing my book, like I was, today they were talking about the dates, this happened in September and blah, 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 and I was finishing my book, so extraordinary that even the stuff that came before it seems like somehow diminished by it.
Right.
But I read the Mueller report several times. It's an excellent document. Everyone should read it.
So the question of collusion in the end, is that the right question, and does the Mueller report establish that?
Well, I don't think it's the right question. I think the right question is what was going on, which I think the report sort of answered. I mean, all of the stuff about the Trump Tower Moscow negotiations are so shocking that when you think that, I mean, this was such vintage Trump. He was going to the mayor of Moscow and saying, I need my zoning approval and I need the parcel of land on which to put my tower. And this was the same kind of beseeching that Trump had always done, except he was doing it with a hostile foreign power while he was running for president. And to me, like, that in itself is shocking enough. So I think it's important to not be so inured, because these things keep happening, to think like it didn't really say anything. So I do believe that. I mean, I feel disappointed that people don't really understand the story, but I don't think that, and I think the question of collusion was smart on the part of the Trump team, getting people focusing on that, because then people go down this road there's no collusion, and anyway, collusion isn't a crime, which is technically true. But there were all of these ways in which the Trump campaign made themselves open to Russian approaches while they said they weren't. And to me, that is extraordinary.
So,
are we going to talk about Gorkov?
You go for it.
So, there's this Russian banker that Jared Kushner met with named Sergei Gorkov, who met with him after the election. And Jared Kushner seemed to want people to understand that he thought so little of this meeting. He told Mueller's investigators he had not even Googled him. He's one of the top bankers in Russia. I'm sure, Frank, you know more about Gorkov than me. So maybe you could please fill in the background. But the thing about Gorkov that was so amazing is this was in December of 2016, so put your minds back there. He brings Jared Kushner 2 gifts. He brings him a piece of artwork from Novogrudok, which is the town where Jared Kushner's grandparents were from, and he brings him a bag of dirt. So hopefully people remember the significance of the bag of dirt from what I was saying earlier in the evening.
He Googled Jared Kushner.
He Googled Jared Kushner. But I mean, it was not just Google. Yeah. It was serious research. The dirt had been dug out of the tunnel and hidden in the walls. And it was the key to the Kushner family's survival, these bags of dirt. So that was one of the most amazing stories to me that came out of the Mueller report. And Gorkov is such a powerful Russian banker. So the idea that such a powerful Russian banker who said that he had a direct line to Putin when he went in is somebody that you wouldn't Google, to me, that itself is cause for pause.
Yeah, absolutely. Just in this genre, are there any other plot lines or storylines that you feel like continually shock you, that have kind of eluded the public consciousness?
Well, it's an interesting thing, because this is a more general response to that, but I still can't believe what is happening with Ukraine. So when I started writing my book, it was actually while the Paul Manafort jury was out. And I wrote the introduction because Paul Manafort had a townhouse, a brownstone, in Brooklyn, near where I live. And so that brownstone was paid for by corrupt oligarchic wealth that had been money laundered through Cyprus and the Caribbean and into this house in Brooklyn. And I had covered corruption in New York for 25 years, and I didn't know that was happening. And to me, it was a symbol of not only the sort of oligarchic money coming into New York real estate, but the money flooding into the political system at the same time. And I think that is something that it's sort of like the frog in the boiling water. People don't really appreciate, and even I didn't appreciate, and I study this is my business, how much it had pervaded the systems. It had come to my very neighborhood, and I didn't know. So I thought, okay, that's a great way to start a book. I didn't know when I started it that way that Ukraine was going to come back. I didn't know Rudy Giuliani shows up in an early act of my book, which is in 5 acts. He comes back. Paul Manafort, Roy Cohn, Roger Stone, so many people keep recurring. The epigraph of my book comes from an interview that Charlie Kushner gave, an unpublished interview that he gave with the New York Times, in which he said, "No human being could write this script, only God could have." And I feel that way. I feel that I can't believe the way this story has turned out. I can't believe the circularity. So Ukraine, I'm trying to remember when the scandal broke. I feel like it was September 18th, September 19th was around then we knew. And my colleague Ilya And I had been saying, like, oh, yeah, somebody should go to Ukraine. Yeah, we should go to Ukraine. We should go to Ukraine. So he's about to get on the plane when the scandal breaks and we realize it's Ukraine. And I felt like all of the worlds were coming together. This symbol of this place where these incredibly wealthy people just buy the politics they want was being married with our own system. And not just married in a theoretical way, but there were actual people who were vectors straight from that to President Trump.
No, I think that's extremely important as we stand here on whatever the concluding day of the opening arguments of the impeachment trial.
It's unbelievable.
Of the president.
I can't believe it's happening tonight.
Yeah, that's the right way to time a book launch. Before we open it up to questions, and I think you've given there's so many strands in what you've described that we could keep picking at because they're so important and so interesting. And as you say, it's like the themes just keep recurring. The characters keep recurring, and the things that you don't think are gonna, wrap themselves into a coherent narrative end up becoming that coherent narrative in a terrifying, dispiriting sort of way. But one thing that I found very powerful is towards the end of the book, you invoke Hannah Arendt, and you mention in I think the epilogue of the book that your father, Richard Bernstein, is a philosopher and one of the foremost students and explicators of Hannah Arendt. And so, could you just describe how you use her as a tool for understanding what's happening?
Yes. So I got to the end of the book, and you can think about I'd read Mueller report several times, thousands of pages of Paul Manafort exhibits. I read the entire all of the land records from the Kushner family going back to 1950 something, and I thought to myself, okay, now I need to read The Origins of Totalitarianism to explain this, and I called because it's a long book. And I was on a tight deadline, and I called my dad, and I was like, Dad, can you tell me the parts I can read, or can you suggest some things? And he was like, don't just read these 6 books. And then you'll know what you need to know. So we went back and forth, and finally he said, read this essay she wrote called Truth in Politics for the New Yorker. And there's a quote in there about truth and how when you destroy the notion of truth, it's not about one side being right, one side being wrong. It's the whole idea that there's a shared reality and a shared understanding. And then once that is destroyed, it opens the way for all sorts of terrible consequences. And it's one of the things I thought about a lot, about why I was involved in the project that I was involved with, because to me it felt very important to sort of say this is what happened, and maybe it's not going to do anything, and maybe it's not going to lead to a criminal investigation, which is now a matter for the Supreme Court to decide whether any of this can lead to a criminal investigation or any other investigation. But it's going to lay down a foundation of this thing happened in our time, and that in itself is an action. And that's why I quoted Hannah Arendt.
I think on that very powerful note, we should open it up to questions. There's a microphone here. I don't.
So I have a question for you while people are gathering to ask questions, because you know so much about oligarchs and kleptocrats, and I just want to know what your latest thinking is about all of this, given what we've learned in Ukraine.
So there are actually people in the room I can see who know even more about oligarchs than I do, much more. But I think that that we don't know the actors who were behind the Giuliani Parnas scheme entirely. That to me, the fact that Parnas was working for the foremost pro-Russian Ukrainian oligarch who's afraid of extradition to the United States is an important storyline. The other thing I would just say is that this theme of money flowing through politics and the theme of foreign money flowing through politics. If you look at the Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman indictment, they are indicted because hundreds of thousands of dollars of Russian money, according to the indictment, made their way seamlessly into a campaign, and they would not have been noticed unless this scheme had gone off the rails. And so that begs the question, how much more money flows through our system that we don't know about. And the one thing that's happened in this administration is, all right, so when it comes to disinformation or election hacking, we're at least making an earnest effort, or maybe not a full-throated effort. We've done various things to try to tighten up the ship after the election. But when it comes to foreign money coming into politics, we've actually further legalized it and further normalized it. And so I worry that that the floodgates have now been opened.
I worry too.
Well, I worry too. So thank you very much. This was even more interesting than I thought it was going to be.
Oh, wait, before you talk, I need to say something. If anybody wants to leave, please make sure you buy a book. And buy one for a friend as well.
So here's my question. I paid no attention to Trump until he announced his presidency. But what I've been struck by is how much he sounds like a mafia thug. I'm sure there's a nicer way to put that, but I'm just going to leave it with that. And during his rallies, there was the undertone of an incitement to violence. Today, there was the release of the ABC tape where he says, "Get rid of her," about Ambassador Yovanovitch, I'm sorry. Thank you. My question to you is, did you uncover violence that, this man seems very comfortable with it. And the way he said it, when I first heard it, it was, he's not saying recall her. He's saying get rid of her, kill her. And it's terrifying to me.
Well, I don't think we know exactly what he meant by take her out. Could just have been remove her.
Take her out for dinner. That's what he meant.
That the family, structure is, a structure where all the power flows to the patriarch, where there are, the company was like spokes of a wheel. People didn't know what they were doing. Was, a sort of, both Jim Comey and Andrew McCabe have described this as a mafia-like structure. But I didn't uncover any particular acts of violence in the sense that I think you're saying, of somebody actually being physically hurt. There were a lot of ruined lives, though, in the Trump family business and around the Kushner family as well, for ways that we see, sort of revenge and bullying and that kind of situation.
But you have, okay.
But one thing just to add, you should add to this just the way in which members of their own families are among the various victims, right?
Yeah, try to tell in the sort of 40-second version the story of Jared Kushner's father. One of the things he went to jail for was hiring a police officer to hire a sex worker to entrap his brother-in-law, who he thought was conspiring with Chris Christie against him. So, obviously that is a, very destructive act.
So it's not totally foreign.
Hi.
There's another billionaire running for president who makes a cameo in the book.
Oh yes.
And it's Michael Bloomberg.
Yes.
And I'm curious if there's more to say or to talk about and sort of the role that he played in Trump's sort of life during that period and sort of making Trump and Kushner's businesses possible and all that.
So Bloomberg was mayor in this period, and I covered Bloomberg from when he ran for office all through his mayoralty. And I am kind of surprised to find myself thinking about him again. He's somebody that definitely broke the systems. He spent more money on his campaigns than I think any local candidate in the history of ever in the U.S. And he also created a New York which was very open to wealth. And there's a quote in the book about how he's saying, like, bring in all the Russian billionaires. That's exactly what New York needs, because they'll pay us taxes. So I think that there's a lot of reckoning to be done about the ways Bloomberg structured New York that made it very welcoming to oligarchic wealth and flight capital, that all happened while he was mayor of New York City, and he did welcome it. But I don't want to, there's a lot to say about Bloomberg, and I've tried to keep my mind confined from it because I just want to jump into the Bloomberg story because I covered him so much and I see so many similarities between his campaign now and his first campaign for mayor. But I'm going to stick to my subject matter.
Thanks very much for a great
Thank
talk
you.
and a great book. I'm from Chicago. So yes, and I think they already know where I'm going with this. So as I'm listening to your description of oligarchs who are multi-generational, who are setting the rules, who are breaking the rules, who have all kinds of connections with seedy characters and all kinds of stories related to actual violence, the Daley family, certainly comes to the fore. Of course, there are other folks who would point to Joe Kennedy and stuff. So what I'm really wondering is, as you've done your research and you've thought about this, do you think that you're studying sort of unique phenomenon with Trump and the Kushners, or you think you're uncovering a general phenomenon? And if it's general, what's the root cause?
I mean, I think it's both. I think it's really both. I mean, I was looking at these particular families and the way that they used money to corrupt the system at the same time that there was this national movement to try to break campaign finance laws by people who are or have been in the government, like Betsy DeVos's family and Don McGahn. There's a whole story about Don McGahn and how when he was FEC commissioner, he wouldn't let any campaign finance cases be prosecuted, including one that involved Michael Cohen and Donald Trump that is strikingly similar to the one that Cohen is serving prison time for. So I think that there was sort of like a kind of a large assault on systems and also this destruction from within by these two families who were emblematic but not necessarily typical because they were such outliers in the systems that they were in. I don't know that much about Chicago. It would probably take several lifetimes for me to sort of comprehend the Chicago corruption. Obviously, what makes these families interesting is that they're in power now and examining the trajectory that brought them there. I mean, I think that, I covered the 2016 campaign, and at the end of it, there were a lot of analyses of sort of this was a fluke phenomenon. And one of the projects of my book was to show this is not a fluke phenomenon. This is a decades-long set of decisions by politicians, Republican and Democrat, that have led us to this moment, and that's what we need to be examining.
Hi, I think I've listened to every episode of the
podcast.
Yay.
Thank you. Do people, by the way, TrumpIncPodcast.org, you can find the podcast. You can subscribe on Apple or wherever you get your podcast. It's free.
Yeah, it's excellent. It is free, and it's excellent. Ukraine, obviously, Russia are all very interesting. But I was struck yesterday. I saw this long thread on Twitter posted by Will Bunch, who writes for the Philadelphia Inquirer, about Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Connecting, I mean, obviously Jared and MBS are close friends, and apparently Jeff Bezos is not really a friend of his anymore. And of course, MBS also has Jared's WhatsApp contact information. So it seems likely that MBS knows more about Jared than Jared
It could be.
wanted. But there are other. I don't think the podcast has really gone into.
Funny you should
Saudi
say that
Arabia.
because we were working on a Saudi episode, and then there was this whistleblower report, and it
Yeah, that's important.
it kind of diverted us. But I do think it's very worthy of inquiry,
Yeah.
and thank you for raising that.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. So I was just wondering, because you were mentioning some of what's gone on with the Kushners in terms of the father and what he did to his brother-in-law. Do you mention at all what happened with Trump's brother who died young? Because
Yes.
okay, yeah, and the only reason why I bring it up is because if for people that don't know, so when he died at 43, Trump took care of the will of the children, and one of the things that he did was made sure that the money from Fred and the organization that would go to the children, but it wouldn't go to the one child that had muscular dystrophy or cerebral palsy, one of the ailments. So just to further highlight the wonderful human being
there's
that
a
we
lot
have.
of family drama, and I was able to get the wills of the grandparents and sort of trace the money flows, which is one of the things I really tried to spend some time doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Just a question about tradecraft. Was there one discovery that you made in the course of doing the book, where you were digging into documents that you were most proud to have found?
When I got the case file from Jared's grandparents, where they showed how they had immigrated to the U.S., I felt like that was sort of the biggest moment of discovery. But there were many, many, many. I mean, reading the wills was one thing, reading the land records, reading all the court records. There were just so many fascinating documents. I mean, one of them was the Mueller report, where there was the whole thing with the bag of dirt. And I was like, oh, my God. So, having all of that laid out in a way, only God could write this script.
So I think we've arrived at our hour. And just say that I think one of the ways in which we can all respond to the condition that we're in collectively is to, not become a nerd to it all, but to kind of to be able to refresh kind of our sense of what exactly is happening, and to understand it in this deeper sort of way, where we're connecting it to these broader phenomena in our society, our economy, our democracy. And so, of course, one of the ways in which I think we can kind of stay on our feet as citizens is to buy this book and to read this book. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you for coming.
I want to thank everyone for coming. If you'd like to purchase tonight's book, you can do that at the register. Please take your